right, welcome to technical session number 8. We're talking about the CPU, or central processing unit, which happens to be the brain of the computer. We're going to be getting into all sorts of things. We're going to take a look inside this chip. Can't see much here with the little cover on, but we're going to be taking a look inside there and get a better understanding as to how the CPU works, different types of CPUs we have. We're going to be looking at different levels of cache memory, because there are actually 3 different levels that we need to be aware of for the exam. And that is the memory it uses up before it starts using the RAM for the computer itself. So it actually has its own little built-in sets of memory. Some of the objectives we're going to be going through, we're going to be describing the different types of processors and articulate how to select a processor to match your system needs. Identify the CPU as the central processing unit and explain its purpose and requirements to keep it functioning. Choosing the appropriate cooling method, as there are a few. Thank you, DW. And name the steps to replacing and installing a processor. Some of these may sound familiar to you, as we did go over them a couple times last week. Identify common pitfalls when installing a processor. Use that little chip extractor, otherwise you can damage that CPU. And given sets of symptoms, identify common CPU problems and describe how we solve them. Throughout this technical session, the 2 BSMs we want to keep in mind, or behavior skills and mindsets, are adaptability and growth mindset. We want to be able to change to our ever-evolving market and industry. And we want to remember that our intelligence isn't fixed. We can grow as people. We can, strengthen our memory and other skills. Our mind is like any other muscle. If you exercise it, it grows stronger. If you don't, it starts to atrophy a bit. All right. So, types and characteristics of processors. The CPU, or central processing unit, is installed on the motherboard itself and is the main determining factor of the computing power of the system you're working on. At the time of this, there were 2 main manufacturers. Like I said, there's a third kind of rising now, but we'll see over time how well they do. You have Intel and AMD. And each of these manufacturers have a multitude of types of processors that they use and characteristics depending on the needs of the system. So, Intel, they provide desktop and laptop processors, and they're sold under Core, Pentium, and Celeron brands. Do you need to know all the different types of chips they have out there? No, but if you see one of these 3, Core, Pentium, or Celeron, it should instantly guide you to Intel. They're very low power, portable smartphone chips are called Atoms. And then they have extremely high server chips called Xeon. So some of the laptops have Centrino technology, which interconnects the processor, chipsets, and wireless adapter into a single unit to improve performance. It's just kind of a basic overview of the Intel chips. At the time of this, these were the chips that were out. So this is at the time of the 1001 being created. You had the Intel 404, 80, 86, 8386, the Pentium Core 2, and then they got into the i3, i5, i7s. And you can see the architecture they have being a 4-bit, 16, and then you get into the 32 and then the 3264s. 32 and 64 are predominantly what we deal with in this course. because almost all your operating systems are based off of one of those two architectures. See, can anybody make out this picture here? Does anybody know what that is? The bottom left, right here. It's like a mesh weave of, it's like carbon or copper. It's held together in wires.
There's a magnetic processor.
I mean, it is a processor. This is probably one of the earliest ones you would find. And this processor here represented a single bit. So it could either be on or off. That's it. If any of you are familiar with Mythbusters, there's a guy in there named Adam Savage, who's the redheaded guy. He actually runs another channel called Tested, and they actually talked about this. It was kind of cool. I'll find the link to it and drop it in if you're interested in, it kind of gives you a little bit of the history on computing and stuff like that. Just kind of a neat little tidbit. All right. AMD, the other side of the coin for processors. We have the company's called Advanced Micro Devices. They are typically more popular in the gaming markets due to its advances in the integrated graphics and the processing unit, also due to their price point, because they tend to be a little bit less expensive than your Intels. AMD uses different sockets than Intel, so the motherboard must be designed for one of those types of processors or the other. So remember, we were talking about the LGA versus PGA. So the chips are designed differently. The motherboards need to be able to accept those chips. The families of chips within the AMD are the FX, Phenom, Athlon, Sempron for desktops, and then you have the Athlon, Turion, V-Series, Phenom, and Sempron for laptops. Again, you don't need to memorize every chip that's out there, but you should be familiar with the families so that you can instantly associate it with one type of chip or the other. So here it goes, where they kind of break down the chips, where you have your gaming segment, which is like the Athlon, was it TX? Again, this is from about 5-6 years ago. So this is going to have extremely high processing power, going to be ideal for 3D games and 3D modeling, things like that. Then you're going to start working your way down to the digital media segments, stuff like that. Mainstream, which would be, average office use, and then value segments for, more budget uses could be for schools, possibly personal use if you use computers for limited things like email, web surfing, stuff like that. Marvin here put this in here, one of my old TAs. So you can kind of see when you pull up on your computer, you can tell right off the bat, you can go into, here's your path control panel, all control panel items, and then into your system. And then down here, you can see where your processor is right here. And it'll tell you exactly what you have: an AMD Athlon 64-bit architecture, X2 dual core processor, 4400. So if you're curious as to know what your computer has in it, you can go into your system properties, check it out, and see what you're operating with. All right, this one should look familiar. So we're talking about this on Friday. So it kind of breaks it down real quick. We have our clock generator over here. We have our North Bridge, which is where all of our quick components need to be attached to, like our graphics card for our PCI Expresses or AGPs. Then we have our memory banks over here. So all that needs to have extremely quick connections to the CPU. So it has to connect through the North Bridge. South Bridge Slower connections are input, output. So like serial ports, printers, floppy disk, hard drives, keyboards, mouse, all that fun stuff. And then your flash ROM for your BIOS all connect through the South Bridge, as well as your older PCI expansion slots as well. So inside of a chip, we have a few basic components we need to be aware of. So we have our main part, which does the actual computations, which is the ALU. That is our algorithmic logic unit. And then we have our control unit, which is kind of like a traffic cop, where it's determining where the pieces need to go. We have our IO unit, which is input output unit. This is how it connects to the outside to go to our North Bridge, where it's going to communicate with the RAM and the rest of the computer. And you have your internal memory cache, where if the ALU itself is not able to hold on to the information it's processing it, and it's going to need that information relatively soon, it can put that information into the internal memory cache and then pull it out as it is needed. And then you have, go ahead.
Hey, Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
do you mind explaining what an ALU means again? The algorithm control unit, like its functions?
It's basically making mathematical computations. So it's processing the information that it's given. So like when you see a picture on your screen, you know, the computer doesn't see it as we see it. It breaks it down into ones and zeros. And based off those ones and zeros, the ALU, the algorithmic logic unit, is creating mathematical computations, which eventually pushes this image out to the screen that you're seeing now. You know, or when you click on a program, it's running through those computations to tell the rest of the system, hey, we need to open Microsoft Excel. So that is what the algorithmic logic unit is doing. So taking a screenshot of this is kind of helpful. So I do recommend it if you have not. And then your registers up here also hold on to small bits of information that are part of the instruction sets for the ALU as well. So yes, algorithmic logic unit is where most of the processing is taking place. And these other pieces are mostly supporting the ALU. All right, so let's break it down here a little bit better. ALU, or excuse me, input output unit, manages data and instructions entering and leaving the CPU itself. The control unit manages all the activities going on inside of the processor, where the information needs to flow to. It's kind of like the traffic cop inside the CPU itself. You have one or more ALUs, and this is where the logical comparisons and calculations are taking place. And then you have the registers, which are small holding areas on the processor chip. They hold counters, data, instructions, and addresses ALU is currently processing. And then you have your internal memory cache, which holds the data instructions waiting to be processed by the ALU. And then the buses are the little lines that connect everything together, which the data travels along. So this is another good one for a screenshot. Also, I mean, we are going to drop the slides as well as student paste in Slack as well.
It's already on there.
Never mind, it's there. Are we good? Questions so far? Let's get the basic definitions out of the way. All right. So some factors to consider when selecting a CPU. The speed at which the processor operates internally is measured in gigahertz. And you need to make sure that the clock speed on your motherboard supports that type of CPU. We need to take into account also motherboard restrictions, the CPU architecture. We can't put a 64-bit into a 32-bit motherboard. Won't function. Memory cache. Do we have enough memory to support it so that it can operate at peak efficiency? Socket and chipset. You know, we need to make sure that that chip can actually fit in the socket that we're putting in, and they have different pin arrangements, different designs, different sizes. We need to make sure that they can match up together. And also memory capability. Also, we're going to get into multi-processing abilities, where we have dual processors, multi-core processing, as well as multi-threading. And then finally, CPU's features support for virtualization, if that's something that we wish to use our systems for, integrated graphics, and finally, security. All right, when we talked about our motherboards, we did talk about clock speed. This little thing right here has a nice fun little quartz crystal inside it. Once you apply electricity to it, it oscillates, essentially creating the clock speed for your processor. And a CPU's clock speed is the maximum speed, not the speed that it must run at any given time. So it can go slower than the clock speed, but the clock speed sets its maximum pace. And then you have what's called a clock multiplier. So all modern CPUs run at some multiple of system clock speed. The CPU's speed and multiplier are set automatically by the motherboard. So you remember when we were talking about the RAM. So you have the clock that's running like a metronome, and that would be like whole notes of music. And then you have the RAM, which can operate at different intervals within that clock. So you'd get your half notes with your DDRs. Your DDR2s would be quarter notes, and then you're building upon that. So you're still operating within that clock speed, but you're able to manipulate it a little bit to get more out of it. All right, CPU architecture. This becomes important when you're selecting operating systems. So 32-bit processors known as x86 processors. And they can handle 32-bit instructions from an operating system. They cannot handle 64. Then we move to 64-bit, known as x64 processors. Somebody have a question?
Oh, I call.
Oh, okay. So we have x64 processors, and they require a 64-bit operating system, but they can simulate 32-bit applications. So they can run a simulator as if they were a 32-bit architecture to run 32-bit applications. And then we also have hybrid processors, which are known as x86/64 processors, and they can handle either 32-bit or 64-bit operating systems. And AMD was the first one to push one of these out. questions so far? So fun little historical story. If we go back here real quick, I believe it was AMD that did this. So if we go back to this page right here, you see how they have the different levels of chips. So you have your economy value segment all the way up to your, super powered gaming processors. Well, setting up assembly lines for multiple types of chips can be really expensive. So at one point, this was probably in the early 2000s, I think AMD got the bright idea that what they were going to do was they were only going to create one chip and sell it as all of these. So you're going to create one chip and then put blocks in the software so that it would only run as a value AMD or a mainstream AMD. So you'd have to buy more and more expensive chips. Well, the fun thing is it does not take people long to figure these things out. So shortly after processing began or manufacturing began, people realized that you could overclock these things way over the specifications that they had. And so rapidly it got out that basically all of them were the same chip. They just had different stickers on them and different, settings. So all you had to do is buy the cheapest level chip you could find and then set it to the highest level. So what do you think happened? Gamers figured it out really quick and all of them bought value segments. So none of or very few of the high-end chips ever got sold off of this batch. They did not make this mistake again. And I imagine the marketing guy who figured that out and thought that this would be a great idea did not work there very long after. So, quick little story on that. All right. Multiprocessing. Is anybody here familiar with Moore's Law? Anybody ever heard that term, Moore's Law? See a couple people nodding their heads. Every 18 months, technology doubles, processing speed doubles, and cost gets cut in half. It got to a point where, and they also got smaller. It got to a point where we didn't think we were going to be able to keep up with that. And then somebody came up with the brilliant idea of multi-core processing. So it's kind of a cheat, but still allow us to continue on that Moore's Law curve technologically. So what it is, so multi-threading, let's get into this first. So what multi-threading is each processor or core that you have, back here, yeah. So you've heard of the dual core, quad core, processors and stuff like that. So each core you have, once they've developed this multi-threading technology, can perform two tasks at the same time as opposed to a singular task. Prior to this, they can only perform one. Now they can do two tasks at the same time, which is interesting because it allows a single CPU to act like two. So each core you have inside of your CPU can act as if it is two cores. So if you have a dual core processor, it can act like a 4-core because it's able to do what's called multi-threading or performing two tasks at the same time. This was developed by AMD. Intel has their own version of this, and they call it HTT or hyper-threading technology. So AMD started doing this as well in 2017. Yes, Danielle.
Is there ever a time where we're gonna have to know if it's acting like two?
They may ask you what is multi-core or what does multi-threading mean?
Okay, thank you.
So it's, in a definitional sense, they may say, what is multi-threading? What does it mean when I say it has hyper-threading? Or what type of technology allows a processor to process 2 threads at the same time or 2 tasks at the same time. So in a definitional sense, yes, you are likely to be asked about this. All right. So multi-core is the combination of multiple CPUs or cores into a single chip to increase its processing power. So inside of this main chip right here, you'll have 4 CPUs within it, or 4 cores, as they call it. So it is extremely common to have multi-core processors at this point in time. Now, it's kind of interesting looking inside of it. There are pieces in here that we will over time begin to recognize, but what does this look like to you right here? Looks like a little metal plate, some stuff sticking up out of it.
Looks like a bank. Like a memory bank.
Looks like a bank, okay.
Oh no, it's a adapter of some sort, connector.
Connector, okay. Any other guesses? Memory, yeah, it's a possibility. Give you a hint. It's a metal plate with a bunch of little metal spikes sticking up out of it.
A heat sink?
Heat sink.
Wow.
So even inside the CPU or the processor unit you still need heat management. So they have heat sinks built in there. So here we have our CPUs. Remember back here when they had that diagram inside the CPU? Where was it? Oh, there it was right there. So right here. So here's our basic components of a CPU. Well, this is just one of the cores that we have in this chipset. So that diagram actually fits inside this little box right here. So that makes up a singular core.
I have a quick question about the previous slide. I don't know how it compares to this slide. So this multi-processing unit here that has 4 cores could also be doing multi-threading to do 8 tasks?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So if you look at, if this was a quad core and then you looked at it on your computer, it would actually show you as if you had 8 cores. Because you can actually look and see how many cores you have on your computer. And that's where people will sometimes get confused. They're like, I have a quad core. Why is it showing 8 CPUs? 8 cores, but that is due to the multi-threading.
But then there's the possibility as well that like it doesn't have the multi-threading, right? Like there's like 2 separate.
It is possible, but it is far more common today to have the multi-processing than to not have it at this point.
Oh, okay. Alrighty.
All right. So let's see if this is time to, yep. All right. So now we get to talk about cache memory, which is where we kind of store stuff while we're working on it. And so we can have quick access to it. And there are 3 different levels of cache memory. So we have what is called our L1. Right in green. So we have our L1s. So each CPU has its own L1, which again is just kind of like some storage so that it can hold on to stuff while it's calculating. So each processor has its own L1. So level 1 cache. This level of memory is directly on top of every CPU. Every processor or every core has its own L1 cache. This is by far the most expensive memory. It is the smallest, like the least, the smallest amount. And it also happens to be hands down the fastest because it is directly on top of the processor itself. So it's built into that processor. That's your L1 cache for each one. So now, after that, we have our L2s, which 4 cores, so each core has its own L2. So it's just outside each processor. You can see them on here. I believe they are right here, 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 and here. I believe those are your L2 caches. Slightly less expensive than the L1. Still pretty fast because each L2 is still dedicated to each processor, and it's quite literally right outside of it. So it's still pretty quick, slightly less expensive, and it has a little bit more memory than the L1s do. So that's our L2 cache. Then we get to our L3. L3 is shared by all 4 cores. Still within the processing unit itself. So you have a level 3 that is shared by all 4, all 4 of the cores that we have here. It is the slowest of the 3. It is the least expensive of the 3. And it is also shared by all others, but it has the largest amount of space too. So the most amount of storage. And you're asking yourself, am I really going to need to know about L1, L2, L3 cache? I got a couple questions of it on the A+. Did you, DW?
Yeah, I think so. They're definitely gonna need to know it for test out and everything else. I mean, it's just good to know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's understanding the architecture.
Mr. Kelly, you said all 4 is shared by L3.
Yes. So, all 4 processors share the L3 cache. So there's only one L3 cache inside the processor. Mhm.
Did you tell them what it's used for yet or not yet?
That they sit there. It's basically used to hold on to information while all the processors are computing things,
Right.
or
So
repetitive requests.
yeah, repetitive so the caches are used to hold on to information for processes that it does routinely. So like if your CPU knows that it needs certain data to do processes, it'll store that data in the caches. So like if it's something that is doing on the moment, it'll store it on L1, and then so it kind of like prioritizes it so it doesn't have to go out into the system into RAM to go get it.
Yes. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Are you guys able to see this, or should I use a different color?
We can see it.
Okay. Just want to make sure. All right. Next. break it down a little bit for us. So memory cache, L1, L2, L3. Essentially, it is a very high-speed static RAM or SRAM that preloads as many instructions as possible from the RAM and keeps copies of already run instructions and data in case the CPU needs to work on them again. So we talked about this. Each core has its own L1 and L2, where the L1 is directly on the processor, the L2 is directly outside the processor. L1, smaller, very short access time, splits into L1D for data and L1I for instructions. L2 is bigger in capacity than L1 with longer access times. And then you have an L3 cache, which is shared by all cores within the processor package. So most current CPUs have what is called an IMC or integrated memory controller included in the processor package. It allows for faster control over the cache memories shared among the multiple cores, and it provides a nice boost in performance because you essentially have somebody telling everybody where the information needs to go. Can that be held by L1, L2, L3, or does it need to be kicked out to RAM?
Hey, can you go back to that one more time, please? I had a question, I think.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if anyone else has this concern, but what was the question here? Okay, it says longer access time. What exactly is that? Meaning what exactly? Because if L3 has a larger storage capacity, why do we need a longer access time on L2? Can you break it down for me?
Well, no, what it is the access time. Remember, it's, like we were talking about with, with the motherboards, it's location, location, location. The closer something is to the processor, the faster it can be accessed because of the shorter distance it has to travel. And we're talking in matters of nanoseconds, right? So extremely short measurements of time. And that's what they're talking about with regards to longer access time. And they're saying L2 has a longer access time than L1 because L1 is directly integrated in the chip where L2 is outside of it. So there is that distance it needs to travel. So it's going to take longer to access that information. Right?
Okay. I thought you meant like you'd stay there longer versus, like grab it, stay there a little while and then come back.
No. It takes us longer to get that information because we have to go a further distance.
Gotcha. All right.
And then L3 even further, plus other people are using it. So that's an even longer access time than an L2. So we're going each step out, takes longer, there is more storage space, and it's less expensive. The closer you get to the processor, the faster, the less space we have, and the more expensive it becomes.
Gotcha.
What is the simple definition of a core? That is a single central processing unit on the chip set, Cedric. So that would be a single CPU within the chipset. So if we look here, this is a core or a single CPU within the processing unit, the larger processing unit. So this one box here is a core. And here is a slightly more organized drawing than what I just did for you, where it shows each core. So each CPU has its L1 cache on each one. You have an L2 just outside of it. And then you have your shared L3 inside of the overall processor. And right here, they have it kind of broken down where you can see it. You have your L1 cache, so they have the instruction and data. They have 32 kilobytes cache size for each. Then you get to your L2, 256 kilobytes, so significantly larger. Then you get to your L3, where you have 15 megabytes, so significantly larger than even the L2. And this is on the i7, but you can also find this information in your system settings on your computer as well.
I know they
Yes,
may
Stephen.
ask about the memory cake, but will they ask for those specific bytes that each one uses, you know?
No, this is just an illustration as to what it might look like for you.
Okay, so it can be
Because
different.
this is going to be unique to every processor type.
Mhm.
So it's just basically illustrating the size difference between the three. Any other questions, comments, concerns? We're all CPU experts. All right. All right. Security with regards to CPUs. So some of them have what is called an EDB, or execute disable bit. And that is security that is built into the processor, which is referred to as XD in Intel and NX in AMD. So when we are looking at system requirements for each operating system, I believe it is Windows 8 and 8.1 require that you have this XD or NX built into the chip for it to be able to function. And this is what allows you to be able to remote disable a computer. So that if somebody takes the computer, then you can shut it down remotely. All right. So when an area is designated for data instructions stored in this area, they are not executed, thus preventing a buffer overflow attack by malicious software as well. Because sometimes one of the ways you can bypass security or crash the system is to make a same request over and over and over again, and you keep making it thousands of times per second. Eventually the system can't handle it, and it seizes and shuts down. And they would call this a buffer overflow attack, and the security bits, the XD and NX, also help to prevent this as well. You need a compatible operating system. If the operating system is not able to work with something like this, again, the chipset may not function right. And it can be enabled within your BIOS and UEFI settings. And though it can stop the execution of that software, the malicious software, it cannot remove it from your system. You will need an anti-malware software in order to remove it so that it does not hamper your system going forward. Yes, Stephen.
I was going to ask, if I have this on my system, I can find out through the BIOS system settings. And you said it can be remotely disabled if someone steals your computer?
Yeah, you may even have something called LoJack on there too. They have like computer LoJack built into the BIOS. You can execute a code that'll shut down your computer remotely.
Yeah, I remember reading that. Mm-hmm.
So it's similar to what we had, like back in the 80s, they had LoJack for cars. So it's kind of like that.
Ms. Keller,
Yes.
will EDB, the executable disabled bits, be an example of an IoT device? Something like that?
An Internet of Things?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No, that'd be something very different. Internet of Things would be like a doorbell with a camera on it, a fire extinguisher connected to the internet, a toaster. So that
Gotcha.
those, your refrigerator, these would encompass, other devices that were connecting to the internet. Light bulbs now can connect to the internet. So that would encompass what is called the Internet of Things.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. The notorious thermometer in a fish tank in a casino that allowed the casino to get hacked. All that is Internet of Things. All right. All right, virtualization and integrated graphics. So if you want to, say, run multiple systems off of a singular unit, like you would have your main computer in your house and all the other computers would run off of that computer, their operating systems, all that fun stuff, you would need to have the capability of virtualization, where you could create multiple virtual machines or virtual desktops for people to operate off of. So say, we work in security and we work in the IT department, which is our overall goal here, right? And we have new updates coming out for some of the software we use. Well, we don't know how that software is going to interact with our homegrown software that we need to run our business. So rather than just uploading it and praying that everything goes right, we can create virtual instances of the different types of computers we have in our network, upload that software in each one of those and run tests to see if it negatively impacts the software we use on a day-to-day basis. So we will know if there's going to be interruptions in operations. And if there is, how severe the interruptions, and then we need to make a determination if we're still going to push out those upgrades now, or if we're going to wait. Because we did have instances going both directions with my previous company where the security upgrades that they had were important enough to where we were going to deal with the glitches it caused, and then we were just going to kind of work around it and try to solve that as quickly as we can. And there were other instances where it's like, yes, you're seeing updates come up, do not install them because they will negatively impact our business and there is not enough gain from it. So, but this would be a way to test it, to make sure that, how it's going to affect your systems, what systems will be affected. It may not be all of them. It may just be, maybe your sales staff all have HP laptops, all the other desktops and laptops work just fine, but just those laptops are affected, but say they don't need to access the systems that it's affecting. Okay, well, then you'd make a decision at that point. Okay, we can go ahead and update their systems and we can still try to solve that problem down the road, but it would be considered a low priority. All right, we will get more into virtualization as we go. Integrated graphics. So many processors may include what is called an integrated GPU or graphics processing unit, as opposed to, with the central processing unit. And then you also will hear the term GPU, which is graphics processing unit. And that is a processor that manipulates graphics data to form the images on your monitor or screen. So what you are seeing when you hear my fun lectures and all that kind of fun stuff, all that information is processed by your GPU so that you're able to see it in a form that makes sense to you. So the GPU might be on a video card, which that would be like an aftermarket upgrade in most cases. It might be built into the motherboard, some older systems, or it may be embedded into the CPU package itself. And when it is inside the CPU package, this is called integrated graphics. Remember how we were talking about with the motherboard? Over time, the goal is to, to move things closer and closer to the CPU and eventually integrate into the CPU, because that increases your processing speed and abilities. So over time, instead of being add-ons, eventually they're built into the motherboard, and then eventually we try to move them into the central processor. Kind of like now, on many systems, the North bridge itself is now integrated into the CPU rather than being on the motherboard at this point, because it helps speed up that communication. All right. So now many AMD processors and then all of the Intel 2nd gen and higher processors have integrated graphics already built into the CPU itself. All right, CPU sockets. You heard us mention this a little bit earlier. Here's a much clearer picture of what we're looking at. So we have our LGA or land grid array. Easy way to remember that is flat like the land. So you have LGA, flat. These are all the connector pieces. On the socket on the motherboard, you would see a bunch of pins sticking up out of the motherboard, and this would lay down on top of it. And those connections would be made then. And then you'd use what is called a zero insertion force connector right here. It's this little door that collapses over, and then these pins come down and lock in place, holding the CPU firmly where it is. Then we have the pin grid array, which is the PGA. As you can see right here, looking at this picture, there's a bunch of little pins sticking up from it. This is an older model. Nowadays, there are a lot more pins on it, and they are a lot smaller in diameter, many of them not much thicker than a human hair. So sticking out from the chips, and these would go into sockets in the motherboard itself. Good question, DW. In chat, you have an LGA, there you go. There you go. So for our Intel sockets, these are the different types of names they have for each of the sockets. Here's the generations to which they are attributed and a description of the chips that are involved. And I know what you're thinking. You're asking yourself, do I need to know this stuff? Answer is mostly no. So what you do need to know, because you likely will get a question with regards to a chip versus a socket. What you do need to know is what socket names go with which chip manufacturers. So you notice all of the sockets for Intel say LGA, right? Land grid array. So all of your socket names for Intel, that's why we keep asking you, what is an LGA? What is a PGA? Who makes them? So all of your LGA sockets are Intel. AMD doesn't make it as easy. But okay, sorry. First, here's just a view of some of your sockets. You can kind of see the pins sticking up here out of it, but you can see each of them are different shapes and sizes. And then this one has that cage open, which would be the ZIF or zero insertion force that holds that CPU in place. Here is that ZIF closed right here, the locking mechanism.
So does that mean I just drop the chip into it, or do I actually need to kind of just press a little bit?
You would set it on there lightly. This one, remember, it's sitting on pins, so you don't want to press it down. So it's just lightly sitting on the pins. So no, you do not want to press it down at all. Once it is aligned properly in there, then you want to close that cage and lock it down. Gotcha. You may be thinking of AMD where you have like the pins and they have to go down in those little holes. Like you may need to kind of move it around a little bit to make sure that those pins are seating in those holes before you close the cage. But yeah, on Intel, do not press down. All right, AMD, they don't make it as easy as the Intel, or the Intel names every one of them after the socket type, which would be the LGA socket. AMD, all of them start with either FM or AM. Easy way for me to remember, it's kind of like the radio. AM, FM goes together, old school radio. All, AMD and then they have AM or FM as their socket types. So if you get a question on this, they're likely to have 2 Intel sockets and 2 AMD sockets. If you know what type of chip you're dealing with, you can instantly, negate 2 of those answers, leaving you a 50-50 shot of getting it right. And again, it's just one question. How much study time do we want to dedicate to memorizing all of this to answer that single question? There's other things that come up that have a lot of questions involved in it. I'd rather focus our energies on that. So, but at least be aware of the families and the LGA, PGA, and then understanding the naming methodology they use, and you will likely do just fine. Real life, we look at the documentation or we Google it if we want to know what chips go with what sockets. All right, here's a look at some of the AMD sockets. You can see it's mostly just a flat surface with a bunch of little holes in it where those pins will go down into it. And we just got to make sure we line these up pretty good, so that we know that the pins are kind of seating down in it. And then we will use our ZIF connector and use that to lock down our CPU at that point. Questions so far with regards to CPU sockets?
Yeah, Mr. Akari.
Yes.
Yeah, with the knowledge so far, so which one is the best to have if I really want to get a system, AMD or Intel?
That is a Ford versus Chevy argument. Meaning if you're, like the car people, you have like a bunch of people with Ford say that Ford's the best vehicle ever, Chevys are terrible. And then you have the other people on the other side saying Chevys are absolutely the best. Fords are garbage. I don't want a Ford. So it's personal preference. But what you will typically see is an enterprise environment in businesses, you will typically see Intel. Personal computers and people doing their own builds, you will typically see AMD. So
Okay.
the answer mostly comes down to what are you using it for? How much money are you willing to spend? Things like that. And you'll look at each of them and just kind of make your decisions at that point.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Heat management. How about before we do this, we take a quick little 10-minute break before we jump into the next section. All right. So we want to get into heat management because CPUs produce a lot of heat. As we talked about, we're getting into the components, the CPU components. CPU can go from room temperature to probably around 500 degrees in just about 2 seconds. And staying at that temperature for any length of time can start to seriously damage the internal components of the CPU. So we need to find a way to effectively remove that heat and keep it operating at a nice temperature. There are a few ways we can do this. One of the most common that you will see is the heat sink and fan method, which is right here. We have that nice little metal heat sink, and then you have the big old fan sitting right on top of it to help you more effectively disperse that heat. And then over here, we can see the infamous thermal paste that you do hear often about. And this is kind of one of those, you can't have too little, too much, or none at all. It has to be there and just the right amount. Otherwise, it causes problems. So here are a couple different methods for cooling that you'll see. We have our passive cooling, which is just a heat sink by itself. Typically, we would see this located on things like the North Bridge or the South Bridge in smaller chipsets. The CPU produces enough heat where it requires a little bit more attention. So we have the heat sink with the fan placed on top of it. again, to help better regulate that. And then on top of that, we need to regulate the air circulation inside the case as well. So we have case fans, which are attached to the case or the box that encompasses it. And you have some at the front that are drawing air in, and then some at the back that are pushing that air out, so you can keep a nice cycle of cooler air running through that CPU, you know, helping distribute that heat pretty effectively. But there are other methods as well. There's one called a submersible system, where you have the entire computer submerged in liquid. You don't see this very often. It is kind of cool to see. They utilize a type of mineral oil, which is really good at dispersing the heat, but it also is one of the most expensive ways to do so, because you have to keep cleaning and cycling out that mineral oil. You know, you have to make sure there's no dust or particulates in there because it could damage the units, things like that. Yes, Danielle.
Wait, so they lose the liquid cooling when it's plugged in, like all the time?
Yeah, this one up here, it is submersed in oil.
How is
Like
that
the whole-
so-
Well, it's non-conductive. Like it's not like water where it's going to allow the electricity to jump from component to component. So they're using a mineral oil that does not conduct electricity, but it's still good at dispersing heat.
Wow, thank you.
So there is that. So that is the submersible system. And then you have below it what is called liquid cooling, which utilizes something similar to like the radiators on your car. So you have the radiator where it runs the water through the engine, and then it pushes it into the radiator where it runs it through a series of tubes that allows the air to cool that liquid, and then it gets cycled back through the engine, and then it draws that heat away again. So it's just that constant cycling of water or other liquid to kind of cool the system down. Liquid cooling does something similar, where you have a piece that is cased onto the CPU. You have liquid coming in, and as it heats up, it gets pumped out the other way, and then it goes through a radiator. That radiator cools that liquid down, and then it comes back and cycles through the pump yet again. It is far more effective than the fan cooling. It's also quieter. Problem is with fans, you know when they stop working because you don't hear them. So if your system's heating up and you don't hear fans, you know your cooling system isn't working. With liquid cooling, because it's so quiet, it's hard to, realize when it is not working until you start getting those shutdowns from overheating. But overall, an extremely effective way to cool down your system. Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, so like if that pump stops working, your CPU could jump up in temperature just randomly.
Yes, well, it'll start overheating quickly.
Yeah, because my
that liquid
friend
is
is
not
having that
getting rotated.
problem.
Yep.
And so it must be his pump then, I guess.
Possible. If he's overheating a lot and he has a liquid cooling system, it could be like, like a radiator. If it stops pumping or stops, circulating that water,
And you wouldn't hear that? Like you wouldn't even like know that it was not working?
No, you wouldn't hear it typically.
Oh man, all right.
It's not
Thank
loud
you.
like the fans. iPhones need liquid cooling. So, and also people will use that liquid cooling to add to the aesthetics of a computer. So like we're talking about, like some of the gaming computers will have like color themes, like where the whole board is like carbon fiber and chrome or something like that, or like one guy did a Bumblebee one where it was like all yellow and black and stuff like that. And they'll color the liquids that go through the liquid cooling to match their color aesthetics that they have for their computers. Like we were talking about before, computers are kind of becoming like art pieces that were, instead of having them tucked under your desk or behind things because you don't want people to see it, you'll display it proudly on your desk because like, look at this big, awesome computer I have, with the clear side panel so they can see all the really cool stuff on the inside. There's LED lights all in them now. So, it's an evolving technology, and people just kind of geek out over it a bit when they see them. All right, next section, steps to removing and installing a CPU. Kind of similar to some of the steps we've gone over in previous slides, but we'll get into it here. So make sure you've read through the documentation received by your manufacturers, making sure that the CPU is conducive to the motherboard that you're going to be using. Keep the new processor in its protective bag until you're ready to install. I know when you receive a new piece of cool technology, you want to take it out, look at it, show it off to everybody, but try to quell those desires, because every time you touch it and move it, you increase the likelihood of an ESD shock to that unit, or dropping it, or some other way damaging that CPU, and they are not cheap. So from here, power down the system, unplug it, press and hold that power button 3 to 5 seconds to discharge residual power. Once it is unplugged and everything's been unhooked from it, go ahead and remove the door to access the PC and use your ESD safety precautions, be it a strap, gloves, or mat. From there, you should be able to see the heatsink, and it is either removed by clips or screws. Once that is done, take care in unscrewing utilizing the FX method so we don't cause any flex in the CPU itself, causing it to bend or break. And then remove the heatsink. Sometimes it can be stuck on there kind of heavy, with the thermopaste acting almost like an adhesive. So you can either do like a slight twist and see if that works. If that doesn't work, keeping some unwaxed dental floss on hand is a nice little trick, where you can kind of slide the dental floss in between the heatsink and the CPU, and you gently saw and pull it through, and that breaks the seal of the thermopaste, and you can remove the heatsink kind of easily at that point. Take a note of the condition of the thermopaste. Is it still kind of moist? Was there enough there to begin with? Is it dry and crumbling? If it's dry and crumbling, clean it off, as you're going to need to reapply. Most CPUs have a arm latch mechanism right here, like we talked about here. It's called a ZIF, or zero insertion force. You would unhook that arm, use that to lift open the door. We do have a video where they show a gentleman walking through this step by step, pushing it away. Once it is open, you can reach in with your chip extractor, grab your old CPU, pull it out, set it aside. If you're going to reuse it, put it in a safe container or anti-static bag. Use your chip extractor to grab your new chip, insert your new chip into that socket. Now, when you're installing, we're going to be looking for a yellow triangle. What does the yellow triangle mean?
Insert here, or no, no pin.
To grab it by the edges.
We have a
It's
yellow
the-
triangle.
It's the formation that the CPU should put in the socket.
Okay, so what does the yellow triangle indicate?
The north point.
North point? What if my desk isn't aligned north, and and my desk has got a southward face, like I'm facing this
That's correct.
way?
It's an alignment grid.
So where is it going?
Yeah,
Direction
we're all
of
knocking.
the-
We're all knocking on the right door. We're all, it does have to do with the alignment. So
That
the
is the
yellow,
direction to follow to place the processor.
correct. So, but the yellow triangle itself, what it really indicates is the spot closest to pin 1. So it's the first pin. So pin 1. And so you will see yellow triangle here, and then there will be a yellow triangle on the board as well. So you know exactly what corner goes to which corner when setting the chip down into the board. So you align the yellow triangle, which is closest to pin 1, to the yellow triangle on your motherboard.
So there will be all the sides or only one side that have it, sir?
Well, if it was on all the sides, that would make it more confusing, right?
No, different things, different signs or something like that, or no, only one?
Sometimes they also have the circle too.
Okay.
But what you're mainly looking for is that triangle and its connection to pin 1. So you match the triangle to the triangle, and then once you've done that, you should be properly aligned for your boards.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
All right. Although nowadays most CPUs have little notches cut in the edges, so it makes it easier to line it up. You know how it's supposed to go in, kind of like RAM modules have those notches so that you know exactly how to line them up. CPUs kind of have that as well. So when you're putting it in, you make sure you look for the indicator, which is that triangle, line it up, set it in, make sure it matches. Others have notches that help align it as well. So once the CPU is in place, close the cage, push the locking arm down in place. Then you would apply the thermal paste to the top of the CPUs, about the size of a pencil eraser. If you're purchasing a new CPU with a heatsink, check to see if the thermal paste is already on the unit, because many of the heat sinks will already have the thermal paste applied. It'll be like a little plastic piece you pull off and it's already there for you. That is a really, really nice feature. And then put that on. If it does not have it, then you got to do it yourself, unfortunately. But definitely check to make sure if you're utilizing a new unit. Once that's done, place the heatsink on top of the processor and secure the heatsink to the board. Make sure you're using the X method if you're putting the clips in or the screws in, so you don't cause it to bend or break. And if required, which it should, connect the power cord from the cooler fan to the 4-pin connector CPU. Fan header for the motherboard right near the processor should be clearly marked. If not, should be easily identifiable within the documentation of your motherboard. After that, replace the door on the exterior of your computer, plug everything back in, and turn it on and pray. Make sure you get past post.
Hi there, this is Ranjit from tech2bus.com, and in this video we're going to install Intel processor on this motherboard. And the motherboard that you're seeing is an OSIS motherboard based on the Intel Z77 chipset. And this supports both the Sandy Bridge and the Ivy Bridge chips based on the LGA socket 1155. And I'm going to use a LGA 1155 chip on the same. And the general thing before attempting to do something like this is that you notice this is the motherboard, and the thing that you have to keep in mind is any static electricity that you might have built up should be dissipated before even you touch the motherboard, because it can damage the motherboard. So I suggest wearing a anti-static wristband or grounding yourself before attempting to do the same. And for this test, let me move the motherboard. I'm using a stock Intel kit in which we get this CPU cooler and the chip itself. And if you take out the CPU cooler, as you see, the thermal paste is already pre-applied. So I'm not going to apply the thermal paste here. But if you're using an aftermarket air cooler or something like that, you might need to apply the thermal paste on the chip. And this is the actual motherboard. Let me just zoom in a little bit. because this is the area where we're going to work. And the first thing you do is gently press this and move this and open this latch, and this latch will open this way. And now you need to open the processor that you have. Do notice that this is the processor and you should not touch this area. Gently lift it, and let me just move the motherboard, and let me show you one more thing.
We're going to
that
ignore
is,
he's using his hands.
a little bit important. Let me see. Yeah, if you notice here, you can see these two notches, and on the socket of the motherboard also you'll have similar two notches. Let me break the motherboard now. And as you can see, here are the two notches. So, and we also have an arrow over here, and we have an arrow on this. So you just gently place the chip and it should sit down. And now what you have to do is bring back this plate like this and depress the lever. Do note that you might have to apply a little bit of pressure. That is okay. Now you have installed the chip. Now what you have to do is, now we are going to install this fan on the same, and to do that it's also pretty easy. Let me show you the motherboard actually. Let me just zoom out a little bit. And if you notice, we have these 4 holes over here, and our stock intercooler will mount there. And let me just zoom in a bit so you get a better view. And what we do is we gently place this over here, over the 4 holes approximately, and those 4 pins should just go down gently. And now what we do is hold on to the processor like this and just depress, and you'll get a clicking sound. And do the same for the next one and proceed with the others. You should get this clicking sound that you have heard. That means we have fixed the CPU cooler. And now the last thing that we need to do is, let me show you the same. Your motherboard should have a header like this known as the CPU fan, and you now just need to attach the CPU fan and that's it. And that's how you have installed your CPU on your motherboard. And let me just turn the motherboard 1 second. And if you look at the back, I want to show these tiny pins. They should come out. That means you have successfully properly installed the stock Intel CPU cooler. So that's how you actually install Intel CPU on a motherboard. And in my next video, I'll be installing the other components like RAM, connecting the actual SMPS to this motherboard, and we're going to power it on. So stay tuned to my YouTube channel for that. If you aren't subscribed, hit the subscribe button. If you found this video helpful, I'll appreciate if you click on the like.
So other than the whole handling the chip with your hands thing, pretty good visual as to, you know, what goes into installing the CPU, getting it in, lining it up with the notches and the triangles, and then installing your heatsink and fan. In this particular one, the heatsink and the fan were a single unit. Many times in the real world, it may not be a single unit. It may have a heatsink and then a fan on top of it. So,
Like button again below. That's it.
Mr. Kelly,
yes.
should we use latex or fabric gloves? Like, which one's best?
Well, they actually would have, I would suggest like they have ESD gloves, and there's gloves, like some gloves like latex can actually cause extra static to build up. So you have to be careful in the types you use. So before you use gloves, it would be good to kind of look and make sure that they're good for working on electronics and stuff like that. A lot of times when you see people wearing the gloves working on videos, they're using ESD gloves. So they're gloves meant to disperse the charge so that they don't damage the components.
Okay.
Mr. Kelly, what was the DIGI abbreviations for, where it said DIGI plus DRAM on the motherboard?
The DIGI?
Yeah, it said it right below the fan there where he was installing the CPU. It said DIGI plus DRAM, which is dynamic random access memory. I just don't know what DIGI is.
So Digi is kind of like, I think they're more, I think it's like a manufacturer type where they, like most of the reference I see to it are like to Internet of Things.
Just wanted to make sure it wasn't something we need to know. If it's not,
No, it's not something we really need to know.
Okay.
But it's more of a like a manufacturing profile. So, all right. Some of the pitfalls you may come across when installing chips on your AMDs. Does happen sometimes. They don't come out easy, and a pin gets ripped out in the process. So maybe one of your old pins gets stuck in the motherboard as you're pulling that processor out. Unfortunate, but it does happen. So when you do remove old pins, sometimes it's good to just take that flashlight, make sure all your pin sockets are clear before you put a new one on there, just so you don't damage any of the new ones when you put them in. For this, they have tweezer sets. Sorry, I muted because Velcro's loud. But they have tweezer sets that are real tiny, really good for things like that. They usually come in kits that you would use to break down the computers and stuff like that. I think I showed my kit before when we were talking about basic tools. I have like a little canvas roll kit here. When you open it up, it's got tweezers, pry bars, a bunch of different tips for screwdrivers, all that kind of fun stuff. Most electronics devices I can break down with a singular kit, and it quickly became the most frequently used kit for tools I use in my house. I don't use it just for computers, but almost any kind of electronics or anything like that, I use this one predominantly. So if you get a pin stuck, pair of tweezers, real good for pulling them out. Just again, try to be careful not to damage the socket. The thermal paste has fused the CPU to the heatsink. We talked about this one earlier. Unlatch and unscrew, carefully do some twisting motions. If it seems like it's on there too good, there's that unwaxed dental floss you can use to kind of separate the heatsink and the CPU as well. The arm holding the LGA CPU socket won't latch. So in the LGAs, they use what's called a ZIF, or zero insertion force. If the arm won't go back down, lift the cage back up and make sure that the chip is seated properly. Because likely if it's not going down and locking, it means it's not sitting on there right. And if you try to force it, it may damage it anymore. Then double check, make sure it's seated properly. If it's seated properly, then you can go ahead and push it down. Yes, sometimes it can take a little bit of force because of the spring locks on it, but just be careful everything is aligned properly before you begin. All right. Thankfully, CPUs rarely have mechanical problems aside from manufacturer's defects. But on that particular occasion, it can be catastrophic to your system. Some intermittent random issues are usually other hardware or where problems causing the CPU to react to such following, like if your heatsink is malfunctioning, like if you didn't apply thermal paste properly, it could be overheating very quickly when you turn it off, and then the system shuts down trying to save itself. So if you have a system that continually is crashing shortly after you start it up, likely you're having a cooling issue. Other issue could be the motherboard itself is not maintaining a consistent flow of power. So it's not getting the power it needs and can cause it to crash. And then there's some intermittent communication issues as well. Yes, Danielle.
When like if the CPU overheats, right?
Mhm.
When you fix the problem, would it come back working again, or like would the CPU just burn out?
Depends on how hot it got. So the hope is that it would come back on when you're done. If you repeatedly keep having this issue and you keep ignoring it, it's kind of like if you ignore that check engine light on your car for too long, it can take like a small problem and turn it into a really big one. Same thing happens if your system keeps crashing from overheating and you don't take care of that issue. If you take care of it relatively soon, it's usually not going to be a big deal. But if you wait and allow the problem to persist, more permanent damage can be done to the system to the point where you may have to replace, the CPU or even the whole system.
Yeah.
Mhm. All right. With that, we come to the end of our journey through the CPUs. We should now be able to describe the various types of processors and articulate how to select a processor to match system needs. We know the two big manufacturers are Intel and AMD. We should be able to identify the CPU on a motherboard relatively quickly and explain its purpose and some of the requirements to keep it functioning. We should be able to choose an appropriate cooling method for what we're going to be using our PC for. If it's just day-to-day office use, a standard heatsink and fan will probably do pretty good for us. If we're going to be doing things like gaming and stuff like that, we're probably going to need something a little more robust like liquid cooling. And if we just really want to spend a whole lot of money, we could probably look at submersible cooling. After that, we should now be able to identify and name some of the steps to installing a new processor. Some of the common pitfalls, like what if a pin gets stuck? What if we can't get the heatsink undone? What if it's crashing right after we start up? Things like that. Any questions, comments, concerns? We are all CPU experts. Man, I love it when that happens. Perfect. Well, go ahead and stop the recording.